So you're free to speak out your opinions during the discussion part. So it's not going to be saved anywhere or anything of that kind. And yeah, so we'll have the presentation by Ryhor first, and then we will open the floor for questions and comments and so on, and hopefully we'll have a lively discussion. So without any further ado, I'll give the floor to you, Ryhor, and yeah, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Gus. Thank you all for joining, and obviously thank you for the invitation and this possibility to talk. It's a real pleasure, and we all tried to do it for a while, so it's always happy to see something really happens, what has been planned. So again, thank you so much. Yes, I will talk about the Russian Belarus policy. I will try to explain Russian policy towards Belarus after the revolution, why to a certain degree it became somewhat paradoxical, because in some, to many accounts, I think the Russia's reactions, Russia's policies towards Belarus after August 2020 events was somewhat contradictory, because it was expected, and we can actually still see these discussions, and this maybe not even discussions, but this somewhat assurance that Belarus is under Putin's grip, that it's kind of a not even soft annexation, but Lukashenko is already doing whatever Putin tells him, and so on and so forth. But in a nutshell, we can definitely see a bit of a paradox, in a sense that the way Belarusian regime looked like in August 2020, when it really weakened, and that only, we can argue, Russian intervention prevented its collapse, and offered this important support which prevented the elite split. I think this would be one of the major impacts that Russia brought, and allowed basically Lukashenko to maintain his monopoly on power in the country. That this all this support, in a sense, went unconditional. So this is what I would probably try to bring by a bit towards the end, but still we'll see that all this economic, political, media, and even diplomatic support that Belarus received came, in a sense, at no cost for Lukashenko. And in this regard, in a sense, contrary to expectations, we see that the Russia's policy rather supported the status quo, and in a sense, Russian post-revolutionary actions has been and are still embedded in the existing model of relations. And this comes even, and I would probably try to highlight briefly maybe 3 points. First, I would argue that it's somewhat can be explained by the fact that this model of Belarus-Russia relations, it mainly meets Russia's interests and also values. So if we approach the Russia's policy towards Belarus from a perspective of that it's both rational and value-driven, we see that in a nutshell, the support of this model actually meets both criteria, and that in a nutshell, it continues to institutionalize dependence and meet the limit, probably we can say a minimum threshold of what Russia wants to see from a post-Soviet country, how it wants it to act from political and geopolitical perspective. The second, we have to look at, obviously, look at this policy from the perspective of Russia's Russia's policy towards European part of post-Soviet space. So we can actually say that Russia's Belarus policy is part and parcel of it, and again, the main criteria is that, or main marker is that the regime maintains geopolitical loyalty, is in the Russian sphere of influence, and doesn't try to challenge that. And probably this marker has been shifting, especially in recent years, towards kind of anti-Westernism, not just geopolitical loyalty, but being the part of Russia's play along Russia in its conflict with the West. And again, Lukashenko, even if he has been trying to maneuver, and I think this is what you've been all noticing in the last 20 years, during even before the election, he still has maintained this minimum level of loyalty always. And thirdly, we have to understand Russia's actions from the perspective of the international context. That not only that the conflict with the West is currently a main driver, as well as Russia's Ukraine policy is the main focus, but also that there are some kind of what we can call it known unknowns, that Russia is not really aware and doesn't have a certainty of what comes after Lukashenko. And this, I think, recent events in the region, and I'm not talking about, I think Kazakhstan actually is somewhat a lesson that both Moscow and Minsk are viewing, and Minsk definitely viewing on the recent events in Kazakhstan from a perspective of the forthcoming vote on the constitution. That it comes to basically, to sum it up, is the question of cost. That if Minsk, if Russia puts the existing model in disequilibrium, what comes out of it, and simply may lead to more costs for Moscow to maintain this geopolitical order. So this is something that we have to keep in mind. Or briefly explains basically why Russia decided to, or Russia still supports Minsk somewhat unconditionally. But to start with, let me briefly, because one of the main arguments, in a sense, is somewhat that maybe is very obvious, but not often underlined, and sometimes it even goes the opposite way when we hear that the Russian-Belarus relations are unique, and that Russia's policy towards Belarus is kind of a special. But I would say that, in a sense, we can say that Russia's Belarus policy is very much fits the way how Russia views post-Soviet region, how it builds its regional policy. And here I would say, and this will probably come as kind of common knowledge, but we can definitely say that Russia views, let's say, dominance or its or post-Soviet space as a region, as a zone of its special interest. That has been said many times, and in this regard, maintenance and maybe even we can say expansion of it has been one of, I would say, two main goals of Russian foreign policy, alongside with the gaining the great power status and somewhat increasing its becoming an alternative center of global influence, something that Russia, we may argue, has been quite successful in the last decades with its campaigns in the Middle East, attempts to build alliances against the West, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to the post-Soviet space, this is a bit different topic. We see a bit of a different result. And I would say that Russia's post-Soviet policy very well explains the evolution of Russia-Belarus relations. So if we look at the Russian foreign policy in the post-Soviet space, I would argue that we have probably two transformative events which happened in the last 20 years. So we can basically say under Vladimir Putin. So if the integration of post-Soviet space has been a major goal, probably until 2004 it was somewhat taken for granted that Russia has a major role, major stake, and it was somewhat a kingmaker in the region. We know that, and we can take a lot of even secondary proofs of that. For instance, that always the new president of Ukraine, or basically we can take any post-Soviet country, would make the first ceremonial visit to Moscow after his election, and Moscow was the main basically umpire in the region. And this was taken for granted. And I think 2004 events, the Orange Revolution, was one of those moments when this was challenged. So Moscow, the inability to elect Yanukovych was a wake-up signal for Moscow that it really has to compete. And to cut things short, we can see that Moscow really moved to policies of active inducement and cooptation. So they were trying to really sort of buy loyalty and purchase local elites, usually via different instruments, to actually induce them to cooperation. And we would have four elements: obviously the political, the allocation of patronage to local elites, different electoral, financial resources, different benefits. Rosukoenergo is a very good example. Then the same with economy, so it would somewhat mimic the European Union, offer this institutionalized cooperation, more developed regional organizations like customs union, and the same societal, different soft power tools through migration, like labor migration, for instance, but also language, media, and obviously, very importantly, foreign policy and security. So kind of a be for these post-Soviet regimes kind of a status quo provider. And it would always move to force, to intimidation only as the matter of last resort. So Georgia would be an exemption. So they're trying to compete through positive inducements with the West, of course, sometimes building up leverage to force, but in a matter of last resort. And we'll bear this thought. I'll come to that when we will come back to the Belarus policy. But 2014 was this kind of a second moment when actually Russia moved to rather intimidating tools. We don't need to discuss this, but this is exactly the case of Ukraine. What happened to Ukraine in the last, since 2014 is a very good example. All kind of a destabilization, assertive mechanisms where Russia rather tried to exploit weaknesses and vulnerabilities rather than purchase loyalty and so on and so forth. But this actually has also had effect on the Russian allies like Belarus and Armenia. And primarily, I would argue this would be the case where Russia tried to resort primarily to new policy tools like same for less. Then the country would get the same benefits like before, but it would have to give the same to Russia, but for less benefits. And again, this very much fits well to the model of the Belarus-Russia relations that emerged. So when we talk about the model, we can kind of describe it as originally as gas for kisses, but we have to see which was based on the fact that that Belarus would offer its geopolitical loyalty primarily, as well as would agree to slow pace integration or institutionalization of relations with Russia, but in exchange for various benefits. And these benefits would be primarily indirect, but also obviously loans and other things that Lukashenko would receive. And the fact was that this, that's why I'm saying that the model has been became the way it was after 2004, was that it was really a major departure from what Putin's Belarus policy originally was, in a sense. So that's why we talk that the Belarus, in a sense, became the role model of Russian ally in the region. So from let's say early Putin days, when Putin was approaching Belarus from a very, I would describe, transactionalist perspective, that he would say, you want this done, you have to do that. And then in the end, this strict conditionality was somewhat maybe most well defined when Putin just said, well, you want to get cheap gas, then you have, first he said, basically, we have to have joint currency and joint central bank, proper joint parliament, government, etc. Or in 2002, he just said, well, let's have Belarus to join us as 6 regions, 6 Russian federal subjects, if it wants to continue to receive our economic assistance. But after 2004, this has been really changed, and what we can say the current model is that that the geopolitical loyalty was the major denominator. The rest, of course, was debatable, but we can see that after 2004, Minsk would still have a lot of stake to, for instance, reject any political integration. It integrated economically with Russia at its own pace. So Minsk had a lot of ability to maneuver and to actually stall Russian economic proposals, be it tax, customs, and so on and so forth. And that, which is quite unique for post-Soviet space, the society and elite were pro-Russian, which is not unique, especially at that time. But Lukashenko preserved this ability to remain a single gatekeeper. So he was the one who was the conduit of basically Russian influence on the elites and society, and Russia didn't have the direct outreach. And this model was obviously somewhat cyclic. It was also conflictual and malleable. And we have to understand that while both parties maintain that the main priority is maintain the model because they serve their major interests, the secondary priorities often clashed. So obviously Russia wanted a faster integration. Minsk sometimes used the opportunities to extract or to demand additional concessions, which, for instance, led to energy crisis in 2004, and obviously used the opportunity over Georgia war, when Russia considered as disloyalty. But Minsk still had a lot of capacity to bargain with Putin, including actually using the European Union and the integration with the West. And actually time is a bit running, so I'll skip the certain elements. But what we, for instance, saw in 2020 electoral campaign, this has been seen before, like for instance in 2010. After 2014, we see that as Russian policy changes, the Belarusian policy also changes. So this more coercive, more intimidating policy in the post-Soviet space, when you try to force cooperation, also had an effect on Belarus. We had new economic policy when Belarus was no longer receiving energy on, let's say, with massive discounts, and oil as well. So there was the tax maneuver. Loans were very on the kind of a limited and with some additional conditions. And Russia even tried to challenge Lukashenko's political monopoly with the ambassador Babic, who was going around Belarus, which was in a very unique way, and were trying to directly talk with Belarusian elites. And Lukashenko basically asked Putin to recall Babic because that was a major breach of his monopoly on power. But even despite, and we have a lot of conflicts, which probably has been on the, and you saw them during 2014, 2020, which always has been packed as whether Russia really changing its policy, and for instance challenges Belarusian sovereignty and plans to occupy Belarus. If we go back to 2019, 2018, there has been a lot on the agenda. But the problem is that, or the question is that, on one hand, we can definitely say that this has been promoted by pro-Lukashenko, at least within forces, but also that Russia, in the end of the day, despite actually Medvedev's ultimatum about these roadmaps that if you don't integrate, then don't ask for more money or get less. But Russia supported Lukashenko in the elections, and it actually gave the regime enough to sustain itself. So this has been always maintained. And then basically, I'll cut short and come to 2020, and after that, so main topic of the talk in a sense, but I think that would help to better understand why things turned the way they went. Then we come to 2020 elections, and we see that this model has been reinforced, so further reinforced. And to many, it's somewhat, and it's actually quite funny, because if we look at the Lukashenko's rhetoric in 2020, we remember the Wagner Group case. These Wagner mercenaries arrested in Belarus when Lukashenko accused Russia of preparing a coup d'etat, preparing violence in Minsk around elections, because it happened like basically 10 days before elections in Belarus. And then in his address to the nation, he actually said, he directly accused Russia of trying to start violence and remove the regime. So, and this was just actually the key leitmotif of his electoral campaign. It was anti-Russian by rhetoric. But then comes the revolution, and we see that Russia throws all possible forces behind Lukashenko. So again, this propaganda machinery, Russian RT crews would come to Minsk and work on the Belarusian television. Immediately necessary economic assistance. Then Putin's promise that if necessary, Russian MVD would support their colleagues in Belarus in Belarus to restore order, and the full backing of Lukashenko with all kinds of visits from Naryshkin to whatever. And we see also that the cost of that was, I would say, at best minuscule. So if we take aside security and defense cooperation, which has been always going in its own path, and I think this is what we can also say has been one of key premises of Russia's post-Soviet policy, because if we, for instance, look at, if we even recall what, according to Saakashvili, was the first demand of Putin to him as the president when he was just elected, was just to keep certain people in the security office, apparatus of Georgia, as like a first step of first sign of goodwill that would help the Russian-Georgian relations to stay well. So besides that, which has not really, even if it remained good at its own pace, it hasn't really got a new impetus, and it didn't really lead to a breakthrough when, for instance, Russia would get a military base or will increase its military personnel on Belarusian soil, or let's say when Lukashenko even asked Russia to provide S-400 or other weaponries that was somewhat ignored by Moscow. We see that mainly Russia didn't get any advances in political, economic, and security integration. So on foreign policy, Crimea was not recognized. So even if Lukashenko said, of course, it's Russian, that didn't lead to formal recognition. And for instance, Belavia, Belarusian air carrier, while being under sanctions in the West, doesn't want to fly to Crimea, to Simferopol. It doesn't do it. The same comes with the economy. Russia didn't participate. There was no privatization. So we can say that, for instance, Belarus-Russia, which is now on the verge of some severe economic pressure, was not. And even if we actually assume that Mazepin and who is the owner of main competitor of Belkali, the Russian Uralkhem company, wants to buy Belarus-Kali, Russia doesn't really want to push it forward. And many other things in economy, like primarily the energy and oil prices go to far below market price. When it comes to integration, yes, they signed these new programs, but in a nutshell, the programs remain the same. In the same form they were discussed before 2020, and the substance is very questionable. And in even furthermore, Lukashenko proposes to begin work on a new integration program. So just remove all these signed documents and just create something new. But all this kind of taken aside, we see that Moscow, very importantly, declines to, or at least until now, has declined to really intervene in the domestic political process and allows Lukashenko to maintain monopoly on political power. And we have a few main indicators. For instance, the transition which many believed was promised to Putin is very much not happening. So while many commentators who believe that this was the main clause of Putin-Lukashenko agreement, there is no signs that Lukashenko is going anywhere. The constitution process, he just said this week that I'm not interested in it. So I think it's like after Kazakhstan events, he says there is no point of doing anything. So we'll have an interesting exercise of probably kind of a useless event where Lukashenko is anyway a winner because he can move the process the way he wants, no matter what whether the constitution changes or not. And all kind of pro-Russian actors, for instance, certain pro-Russian parties that appeared, and even pro-Russian NGOs, they were not allowed to start their work. For instance, the pro-Russian party, which wanted to get legal right to be registered with the Ministry of Justice, was declined the registration, while when the civil society was cleansed last year during summer, autumn, basically most of the NGOs were closed and many went in prison, their workers. The same destiny actually also fell on pro-Russian NGOs. So Lukashenko just decided to swipe everyone at once. Russia has not challenged his monopoly on power and allows him to have the full control over country's political institution, also decide how the transition, whether it goes and how it goes in the end. So and to explain it again, we have to go back to the fact that Belarus is really or let's say Belarusian regime really meets both Russia's interests and also Russia's values. So obviously we see that this model, it kind of entrenches Russia's, it maintains Russia's, not only keeps Belarus geopolitically loyal, but also keeps Belarusian structural dependence on Russia in place and secure. At the same time, Belarusian regime is the best promoter of Russian values. So we see that Belarusian Orthodox Church, how the Russian language is treated, and even this attempt previously of the Lukashenko regime to start the soft Belarusization, showing the limits of how this regime can actually accept any kind of anti-Russian but also pro-Belarusian activities and actors. And in this regard, what the regime did after 2020 with all these, for instance, NGOs and people who escaped the country also very much fit Russia's interest, because it was the cleansing of this national-oriented groups very much fits Russia's interests. The regime also remains and the regime whole narrative and rhetoric about common roots, history, and culture. It's exactly very much fits this civilizational turn that happened in Russian foreign policy. All this promotion of Eurasian or Ruski Mir, even if it's very eclectic and clearing for the Russian promoters of this, it still fits perfectly into the picture, alongside the anti-Westerness of the regime. And in this regard, we can see that Lukashenko, with his actions and the fact that actually Belarus is under growing pressure of the European and Western sanctions, it very much fits the current Russian-West conflict and helps Russia on several fronts. First, it makes Belarus, in a sense, another front of Russian-Western conflict, and the Lukashenko's behavior, like it was with the migration crisis, from Russian strategic perspective, depletes Western resources, and that's really a benefit. And the fact that Moscow is needed to keep its ally at bay is another benefit. But importantly, I think the Russia's loyalty to Lukashenko shows its commitment to allies, because in much respect, if we talk about Russia's post-Soviet policy, which is a bit different topic, we see that Russia's influence has been eroding in the last 2 decades. And this erosion obviously is explained by different factors, including structural changes in the societies, which in Ukraine, actually in Belarus as well. Thanks. I'm finishing. I'll finish now. But one of the elements of this decay is the fact that Russia cannot guarantee the regimes and elites successful transitions from one regime to another, or their hold on power. For instance, how it happened to Yanukovych in 2014, and in a sense, this maybe somewhat diminishes the value of the Russian patronage, these elites. And again, we don't talk about the society. So in this regard, the fact that Russia shows commitment to Lukashenko, despite all the probably, especially we can say not only institutional but also personal problems between Putin and Lukashenko, is quite important. And again, finally, it's an element of the Russian-West conflict. And as Irina Busigina wrote in one of her recent articles, that somewhat Russian post-Soviet policy becomes more and more driven by Russian-West conflict. This plays a major role. I'll stop here so we can have a bit of a discussion. But thanks a lot.
Ryhor, thank you very much. I'm sorry for interrupting you. This was actually a very interesting discussion, and I hope we would be able to continue it now in more of a questions and comments format. So I'll open the floor to comments and questions. So please use the opportunity to ask your questions.